Well, you've made it to week 7, and this last week we covered some challenging material. I trust that you have begun to see that interpreting Matthew well will require a great deal of subtlety and art, sensitivity, not only to the text, but to the concerns and the assumptions of the people who are listening to you as you tell them what this story means. So I hope you'll continue to find our class a resource for you as you're trying to develop the subtle arts of interpretation that I think are required to convey the power of this story in a way that doesn't simply reinforce the existing divisions in our life, in our society, in our world, in our churches, but subverts those divisions, opens up a new vista of possibilities, and enables us to see Jesus as we haven't seen him before. The articles or the chapters by Dubé and Gensch, as we discussed online, I think were very challenging. I just want to reiterate the importance of giving material like that its due. And I think it's easy to grow defensive in the face of that kind of criticism, and there are certain things that I think we should defend. In Group C, if you want to look at the Response Forum 2, in that group you'll see that we dealt specifically with the question of Jesus' sinlessness, and I attempted to defend that in the face of the criticism by Dubé and also by Gensch, but especially by Dubé. But to do that carefully so that we wouldn't dismiss their criticism and settle for some kind of easy understanding of Jesus' sinlessness that removes the scandal of his life and just makes him something or someone that we're very comfortable following. I think if that's the Jesus we end up with, we will not have read Matthew very well. Along those lines, I just want to encourage you with material like that not to settle for a criticism that is simply disappointed in the lack of orthodoxy or the lack of piety, the lack of commitment to the inspiration of Scripture that you detect in that kind of approach, that kind of writing. Those criticisms, I'm afraid, remain pretty superficial and can actually keep us from doing the hard work of actually engaging the questions and criticisms that are developed by writers like that I think is very important for us to digest. And if we're going to push back, having considered carefully what they've had to say and not simply dismissing them for a lack of piety that we think is important in the way that Scripture is read. Just a reminder that Moussa Dubé is writing from Botswana, and she's living in a land where the effects of Christian colonialism have been absolutely catastrophic, and that colonialism has been undertaken with the words, the language, the story of Matthew. And I think that when people express grievances about what the Bible has meant in their places like that, that we should be slow to speak and quick to listen. So continue to reflect on the kind of criticism that they gave us, and I hope that any pushback that we'll develop, and like I said, there is some from me and from others on the forums that I think is very good, but it will be hard-earned. because we have listened hopefully well to their concerns. And the readings that we come up with, our interpretations that differ from them, will hopefully have been chastened by the needed critique that they bring to us in our reading of the Bible. So this week, we move in the narrative from this sort of decisive display of the Exodus power of the God of Israel in the life of Jesus, after he had sort of reached a conflict of a kind of feverish pitch with the authorities at the end of chapter 12 and resorted to a form of public discourse and parables, chapter 13, then withdrew from the sort of front of the conflict, and then was constantly on the move, it seems, never allowing the crowds to amass too much, but constantly crossing the sea, also moving away from authorities who finally caught up to him from Jerusalem in chapter 15, where he had again a rather pointed break, not just with key authorities, but now from Jerusalem. Coming then out of this section of the narrative that we've studied, we enter a really crucial scene whose geographic placement I think is important, as you'll hear from my comments that are recorded for this week. Caesarea Philippi. Think about what the name of that district sounds like, especially to Jewish ears in the story. And it's a really crucial passage, chapter 16, 13 to 28. I hope you'll spend some good time looking carefully at it. Half of the interpretive questions that I've given you in the study forum are devoted to that passage because I think it's so important. And then from that key turn in the story, we have Jesus focusing rather carefully from that point forward, now moving towards Jerusalem, explicitly toward his death, focused on his disciples and preparing them for what lies ahead. And what I want to alert you here to is the way that the narrative has framed the scenes that lead from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem. The narrative framing, I think, helps us to see that Jesus is addressing the key concerns that his disciples will have as those who will sit on 12 thrones, judging or ruling the 12 tribes of Israel as a consequence of what is about to unfold in Jerusalem. The coming of the Son of Man into his kingdom, which will then have ramifications a generation later that we'll learn about in chapters 24 and 25. But this focus on these key considerations for the disciples as Jesus' rulers in the coming kingdom, I think can help us come at the various scenes that we're going to see, because they are not scenes about random topics. So, for example, Jesus is going to be speaking some words about divorce, also about singleness. He's going to be speaking some words about children. He's going to be speaking some words about the urgency of divesting from the sort of wealthy enterprises of the time as well as of ours, and investing in the strange economy of God's kingdom. So you can imagine that we tend to gravitate to Jesus' words on divorce as if it were some kind of isolated moral question. And that's simply not to take the narrative framing of this section seriously. Instead, the way the narrative frames the issue, the way that it arises, is that marriage and singleness are fundamental, key, shall we say, to the dynamics of the social order. And those dynamics are precisely the concern of the disciples as they're being trained to rule for Jesus in the coming age. The same thing would go for children, the same thing would go for how we are to engage the reality of wealth, which remember is associated particularly with land in Jesus' time, although that's also the case in our time, despite the fact that that's more obscure perhaps to our eyes. So, anyway, hopefully you'll be able to wrestle with the topics that Jesus addresses, not as topics much as they are key concerns that his disciples will have as the rulers Jesus is preparing them to be. Obviously, this is the week that your interpretive working papers are due. Those can be submitted really any time starting now, but I've given the official window is from Saturday to Monday. I'd encourage you to submit them earlier in the weekend if you can, leaving you some time to engage with others in the one response forum that there is. Also, I will try to grade these papers in the order that I receive them and get them back to you, of course, as soon as I can so that you'll have them to work with as you begin thinking about your advanced interpretive paper that's due week 10. The assignment for this week, aside from that interpretive working paper, is, as I said last week, less substantial to give you more time to focus on that formal assignment of the working paper. There's just one response forum. There are 8 or so interpretive questions for you to consider. No additional reading besides the commentaries that you're working with, and then my recorded comments on this stretch of the narrative. And I've asked for just one 250-word response, dealing hopefully with at least one question, interpretive question of the 8 that I've given, and perhaps responding to my comments on the narrative as well. But that's all that you'll need to do, at least as required this week. One 250-word response in one response forum. You're, of course, invited to do more than that and to engage more of the interpretive questions, but I don't want to overload you since I know you've got those papers coming due at the end of the week. I suppose there's a mild regret on my part since this stretch of the narrative, 16:13 to the end of chapter 20, is really important, I think, for our learning what it means to be disciples of Jesus, what it means to be church in the world. Those are really the explicit concerns of these 4 chapters. And so it'd be nice if we didn't have such a crowded week with a formal assignment due. But that's how it's worked out, and that's okay. But maybe I'll just urge you, if you are forced because of the interpretive working paper to not give much attention to this section of the narrative, urge you to come back to it if you can and try to pick up what you missed, because I think that this section of the story holds a lot of important learning for us as we try to discern what it means to be a community of Jesus' disciples in our time today. So God bless you as you study this week, as you're working on your papers, and we will be in touch again. If you are interested, I should be available on Friday for some office hours. If you've run into some questions about your working paper that'd be a good time to connect with me. But happy to receive your questions through the other channels that we've established as well. Have a good week.